Right, good evening everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, and many thanks to you all for venturing out on what is quite a wild night, even in local terms, so I'm very glad to see you all here this evening. And as well as that, I would like to welcome our audience around the world, watching by the marvels of new technology. And just to say, in particular to them, of course, we'll have a question and answer session at the end of the lecture, which we'll come on to in a moment. But for that, if you have any questions you'd like to pose, please put them in the chat function on the, I think it's on Zoom we're on tonight. So use chat on Zoom, and my glamorous assistant will relay the questions to our speaker, who I'll introduce in a moment. But first, we've got a little bit of formal business to get through, and for that, I'll call on the director.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can everyone hear me okay? Right. First of all, the minutes of the meeting of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, in their last meeting, held at 6 p.m. in the Augustine United Church, George IV Bridge, Edinburgh, and on Zoom, on Thursday, the 20th of October, 2022. Ian Ralston, President of the Society, in the chair. The minutes of the previous Society of Antiquaries of Scotland lecture meeting were read and approved. The following communication was read. Mary of Guelders and the Architecture of Queenship in the 15th Century Scotland, by Dr. Rachel Delman, University of Oxford, followed by a question and answer session. Is that a correct record?
Thank you. I notice some nods and signs in the room, and so I'll sign the minute in due course.
Indeed. So these are just notices to fellows and guests. Just to remind fellows and to inform guests that our Scottish Archaeological Research Framework project, SCARF, is having its 10-year anniversary event on Saturday, the 26th of November, and we'd love to see as many of you as possible there. It's hybrid. You can come in person and or join online, so you can even join from the comfort of your own home if should you wish. But we would love to see you there. It's an opportunity to, first of all, look back and see what we've done over the last 10 years in SCARF, and also to look forward. What is the future of SCARF? What is the future of research frameworks in Scotland? And we'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. And secondly, of course, our upcoming anniversary meeting will be held on St Andrew's Day, and it will also be hybrid. Please do register as soon as possible, and I encourage everyone to vote online. So when you register, you've got to be logged into our website, but when you register, you will also be able to partake in the voting for not just new fellows, but also new council members who are up for election this year. And we have two very important motions. One is to make a very slight change to the laws of the Society, and the other is regarding your subscription rates. Both are really very important motions that I need as many fellows to vote on as possible. So please do vote. Your votes definitely count. And so far, we've had a very small number of people voting for these things. So the more people vote, the better. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Simon. And so, yes, can I just add my encouragement to those in the room and those elsewhere? Please do vote online. There will be no voting in the room on the date of the AGM. Effectively, the count closes. I think it's advertised at noon the day before, certainly on the 29th. So if you do wish to express an opinion, please vote on the various issues Simon has mentioned by the 29th of this month. Right, well now it's my great pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, Professor Graeme Warren from University College Dublin. Professor Warren has had quite a long career in the Mesolithic. Now he is the president of the International Society for Hunter-Gatherer Research, and has just been organising the 13th Conference of CHAGS, the Conference for Hunter and Gatherer Studies internationally, which was a big meeting in Dublin earlier this year. He's done fieldwork in Scotland. Indeed, he was a postgraduate at Edinburgh many years ago, and I was his junior supervisor, and more recently in Ireland as well. His most recent work in Scotland has been high-altitude stuff in the Cairngorms, and he's developed a special interest in kind of mountain environments and their relationship to hunter-gatherer societies. As well as that, he does a landscape project in Glendalough in County Wicklow, and so it's a great pleasure to welcome him to talk to us tonight on the subject of his new book, which is Hunter-Gatherers in Ireland. So Graeme, welcome, and we look forward to hearing your lecture.
Thank you, Ian, for the introduction, and thank you for the supervision 20 years ago. 20 years since I left Edinburgh, actually, and it's a pleasure to be back. And many thanks indeed to Simon and to the Society for the invitation to speak tonight. And as Ian said at the start, thanks to all of you for braving the really rather rotten weather that's out there this evening. So what I want to do today is give you a flavour of some of the ideas that we've been developing to try and make sense of hunter-gatherer Ireland, and particularly Mesolithic Ireland. And within this, to try and use the Irish material as a little bit of a case study to prompt us to think about the ways in which we ask questions about the hunter-gatherer past and the Mesolithic past. And although the case study here is very much Irish, and I'll give you an introduction to that material, I think the themes I'm dealing with have relevance for lots of different areas, and I certainly think are relevant for the ways in which we make sense of the Scottish Mesolithic past as well. And I'm gonna try and do this by two reasonably extended case studies looking at the ways in which we draw analogies from different areas to make sense of the Irish data, and the ways in which we engage with the material from developer-funded archaeology. These arguments aren't entirely new in the sense that they've been coming out of a variety of pieces of work that I've been doing over recent years. Probably primarily the book that came out in 2022, Hunter-Gatherer Ireland, but then also a series of things that contributed to that book and are reflections from it. So an invitation to write a chapter for a book on the anthropology and the archaeology of scale by Thomas Whitlock and Dolores Cruz. I ended up writing about scaling an island of hunter-gatherers, and that was really reflecting on the writing of this book and quite a late realization about the role that scale played in that. It's also a synthesis of all radiocarbon dates from the Mesolithic of Ireland with Bob Chappell and Rowan McLaughlin that was published in Proceedings of the Royal Irish Academy earlier this year, and that's open access, and you'll see some of the results of that. And an ongoing conversation with my colleague and friend Ben Elliott of University Highland Islands, Orkney, about decolonising the Mesolithic. And we have a forthcoming debate piece in Norwegian Archaeological Review about the role of colonial structures of thought and practices in building our understanding of the Mesolithic, both in the past, but more importantly, as an ongoing aspect of our practice. So there's an opportunity to follow up on some of that if you're interested, and I welcome discussion. So just to set some parameters before I set the problem properly. So the Mesolithic of Ireland, of the island of Ireland, has often been seen as being somewhat different and distinctive than the Mesolithic of Britain and the rest of Europe. And there are a few key aspects of this. The first is that settlement in Ireland appears to be a little bit late in comparative context. We have a small number of different pieces of evidence, but nothing compelling before about 8,000 BC. So this puts us roughly 1,300 years behind the Mesolithic settlement of Britain. And the reasons for this delay have been much debated, but most people assume that it's related to the fact that Ireland was an island from long in the late glacial period. Ireland was an island when the first humans recolonized Britain and Ireland at the end of the last ice age. And as a consequence, it has quite a distinctive fauna and flora, and particularly a relatively impoverished fauna, particularly around large mammals. And we'll come back to that, but people have often assumed that delay in settlement is because of that island status overall. Once we're into the Mesolithic in Ireland, the period is conventionally divided into two periods, an early or earlier Mesolithic from about 8,000 to about 6,700 BC. And that's a Mesolithic which would look familiar to most people in the rest of Europe. It is defined mainly by a microlithic stone tool technology, such as these examples from Glenone at the top left. Very much what you'd find in Britain at exactly this time. However, the later Mesolithic in Ireland is very different. This is and we'll look at this in some of the case studies, but this is an industry characterized by a move to a wide range of different tool types, but lots of use of large blades and flakes made in a diversity of raw materials. And it's been interpreted in a variety of different ways, but it's clearly a distinctive technology. Nothing quite like this is known in Britain. There's something quite similar, but not identical, in the Isle of Man. And the reasons for this difference in technology have been long discussed, and simplifying crudely, and we'll come back again to talk about this. Again, the explanations for this distinctive technology have often drawn, in some senses, on the island status of Ireland at this time. And we don't have to see these large flakes and blades as deliberate symbols of nationalism. I don't think you need people waving them on the beaches at Scotland saying we're different than you. But something is going on about the island status here, and we'll talk about that. There's one, coming from working in the Scottish Mesolithic and my training here in the late 90s and early 2000s, there's one thing I've always found quite interesting about the Irish Mesolithic, which is that there's actually comparatively little synthesis of the period. So if you wanted to look at book-length treatments of the Irish Mesolithic, there's the late Peter Woodman's 1978 British Archaeological Report, The Mesolithic in Ireland. This is basically Peter's PhD, published as a BAR. Really important piece of work, which really, it normalised the Irish Mesolithic from a variety of quite uneven and very insular culture historical references. Peter provided a framework that set this material in context. It's a really important contribution. And then in 2015, Peter published a work of synthesis of the Irish Mesolithic, Ireland's First Settlers, Time and the Mesolithic. That's 37 years between two books. It's a really long time period. If we were to look in Scotland, for example, in between 1990 and 2005, we had 4 books on the Irish Mesolithic. Slightly different in type, slightly different in their interpretations, but all of them telling a story, all of them providing a framework for material, so that if people working on a road scheme, working on a pipeline, if they found some Mesolithic material, they had a context in which to place that. And whilst Irish Mesolithic research, particularly over the last 15 years, has been very, very dynamic, the results of that research are hidden away in conference proceedings and academic journals, and they're much, much harder for people to gain access to and to synthesize. One of the problems about this, and it's tied up with this perception that the Mesolithic in Ireland is perhaps not very exciting, it's not very interesting. Because when people working on a road scheme or a pipeline excavate a site and they do a really good job and they send all the material off to the specialists and they get all the wonderful analysis done, what they end up doing is saying it's a campsite and people hunted these species and they gathered these plants. And of course that's what they're going to say, because we've not given them any other story to actually pin their data to. So it comes back down to, what do hunters and gatherers do? They hunt and they gather in varied proportions at different times of the year. So there's this gap that's there. And alongside this, there's 2 other aspects of discussion which they've been long-lasting in Irish Mesolithic studies, the first one of them, but they've come to prominence again recently. And this is, first of all, the idea that Mesolithic Ireland isn't just insular in the sense that it's an island, but that it is isolated and it is technologically simple, and that ecological impoverishment is also in some way manifest in the nature of human settlement in those areas. And that's received really significant boosts recently. And the other is a couple of what I think is really quite worrying statements from very senior archaeologists that the study of the Mesolithic in Ireland has actually had very little contribution from developer-funded archaeology, from commercial archaeological work. And I think that's profoundly misunderstanding the nature of what archaeology is. What I want to do in exploring these two narratives, this idea of isolation and this idea that there's little contribution from commercial work, is really use them to try and think about two different aspects. The first is the way that colonial legacies, colonial thought, and settler accounts of indigenous people continue today to shape the way we construct the Irish Mesolithic, that we're actually recreating colonial stereotypes of the 19th century in our modern archaeologies of these people. And that, to me, seems concerning. And the second is that sometimes we are still asking fundamentally the wrong types of questions of our data, and that we need actually to allow ourselves to have an inductive moment where we just let the nature of the data appear to us and help that drive the questions. And I want to try and sustain both of those points in what follows. So I want to begin with the first of my case studies. As I say, the strange tale of how archaeologists have turned the Mesolithic of Ireland into 19th century Tasmania. And how what we've done by doing this is take a story which should be about creativity. It should be about dynamism. It should be about adaptation and change, and make it into one of isolation and loss. Okay, so the main thing we're talking about here is this transition in terms of stone tools. It's actually broader than that. There are changes in the nature of mobility, changes in the way that material is deposited into the ground. But most people focus in on the stone tools, and actually they focus in on a really small aspect of the stone tool assemblages. And again, the later Mesolithic is classified by these large blades and flakes. And for a long time, going all the way back to Movius, working in the 30s, right, this particular quote is from the 1940s, for a long time, accounts of these later Mesolithic technology, what Movius called late Larnian at the time, have been quite denigratory about it. So Movius here, these are coarse and clumsy. And it's not just that the artifacts are coarse and clumsy, but somehow there's a loss of vitality, whatever that actually means in this context. But the nature of these aesthetic judgments about the artifacts is then being moved into the society as a whole. And I think before going any further, I would just ask, having worked with this material, having seen quite a lot of it, I'm not at all sure I would describe this stuff as coarse or clumsy or crude. Some of this material is just remarkable. You're looking at blades of chert that might be 15 centimetres long. They're wonderful things. Now, there's a long-standing tendency in archaeological thought here that a really important paper by Holdaway and Douglas in 2012 highlights, which is that for a long time there's been an elision where the complexity of artifacts is assumed in some way to stand in for the complexity of a culture. So if artifacts are simple, then the people who produce them must have been simple as well, rather than understanding the stone tools here as part of an entire suite of technologies and material cultures, and understanding them in the context of their use. Again, as the quote at the bottom suggests here, manufacturing technologically simple flakes might actually make complete sense for what you needed them to do, for the energetic context in which people worked. And I think that's important to hold. There have been warnings about this recently. It's important to hold that in mind. So these arguments about isolation and loss, they've gone on for a long time, and in about 2000, in the early 2000s, there were a series of really good papers by Lauren Costa and Farina Sternke arguing that we should really see this transition not in terms of population and loss, but a transformation in technologies to enable a reworking of systems of mobility so that people weren't constrained to use small amounts of high quality flint. They could restructure their technological systems, allow changes in their use of the landscape and use different resources. A really compelling and a really important argument. Also one which is often ignored, unfortunately. And instead, in a lot of literature, a series of papers by Felix Rieder in 2009 get quite a lot of citation, and you frequently see this in broader works of synthesis. So Steve Mivan and Karen Wick's work on the population histories of Mesolithic Scotland makes reference to and uses the Irish material, these Rieder case studies, as a comparison. So Rieder revisits the early to later transition here, and he does so using a model developed by Heinrich and published in 2004. Heinrich was looking at the population demographics and providing mathematical models of how populations worked. But the central point was that a low level of population, or a population that was subject to collapses, might pass thresholds at which technological complexity could not be maintained. So if you don't have enough people, you can't maintain technological complexity. And he used a Tasmanian parallel for this, drawing on the isolation of Tasmania from Australia. First point to note, Tasmania is a long way further away from Australia than Ireland is from Britain. It's an important difference in there. And using accounts from colonial era Tasmania, including the suggestion that Aboriginal Tasmanians had lost the ability to fish, to buttress this story of technological complexity, and so the decline in technological complexity. And Rieder is absolutely explicit. He's using the Heinrich model in order to, well, he wants the Irish case study to be further support for the Heinrich model, this general rule of populations on isolated islands. You can see again the phrases here from the papers. Islands are prone to demographic loss and stochastic losses of cultural capital. It's a lovely sentence. Targeted loss of complex technologies and maintenance of simple technologies. Much cruder macrolithic tool sets and few formal types. So that language from Movius is back. Felix uses, at the time, he had a data set of all of radiocarbon dates from the Mesolithic of Ireland, and he used statistical modelling to suggest that this showed a decline in population at about the time of the earlier to later Mesolithic transition. So population decline, technological simplicity, it's all solved. Ireland had a population crash and its technology collapsed. And I've argued elsewhere that the data set that Felix had available to him at that stage is simply not large enough to have done that. It's not robust, cannot be considered to be robust at all. And I'll show you some of our models in just a moment. But let's look a little bit more closely at this, because this is all founded on Tasmania here. This is where this idea comes from that Heinrich has. And Tasmania, the colonial era accounts of Aboriginal Tasmanians have long been argued to include a myth of extinction, a series of narratives which suggested that Tasmanian Aboriginal culture was in inevitable decline, and that therefore the arrival of settlers and the genocides that those settlers carried out was merely kind of hastening the end. And that we could, by assisting these communities, we could save them from this decline that was manifest in their history. And again, a range of work in Australia looking at the long legacies of scientific racism that ran through supposedly scientific accounts of Aboriginal Tasmanian societies. And as Annemieke Milk summarises, particularly in here, these underestimations of population, these misrepresentations of cultures, they went alongside an agenda to remove these people from their homes and from their land. They are not neutral scientific accounts. More recently, Australian archaeologists have looked at these narratives of decline, the supposed loss of the ability to fish, the supposed loss of the ability to make fire, and have actually come up with a very, very different narrative, which emphasises change and dynamism, replacement and transformation, in the quote from Griffiths here. So what we see over this period that is supposed to be decline, if you follow that story, is new trade networks, new forms of artistic and ritual practice, and the loss of fishing technology was actually a social prohibition. It was a choice within those communities. So a very different story. And it's really interesting to note that Heinrich's original models in 2004, there was a response paper published which criticised Heinrich on the basis of the mathematical models of population and on the use of the Tasmanian data. Heinrich responded, defending his use of the mathematical models. I have no idea who is right or wrong in that discussion, it's beyond my understanding, but he said nothing about the use of the Tasmanian data. If we actually look at what's going on in and around the time of this transition in Ireland, we actually get quite a different story. So this is, it'll be quite hard for people to see the detail of this graph here, so I'll try and talk you through it. This is the statistical modelling of all radiocarbon dated activity in the Mesolithic that we published earlier this year. The top line is showing the changing frequency of those radiocarbon dates. The second one from the top is showing almost the speed of change in the frequency of those radiocarbon dates. The third line is an interesting one. This is showing the average distance between dated Mesolithic activity of that period. And the bottom one is the Greenland ice core data showing climate change. And I've just highlighted in yellow the period roughly around 6,200 BP when there's a significant, 600-200 BC when there's a significant climate change, and following the period of this early to later Mesolithic transition. What we see at this time period is a very rapid increase in the number of dated sites of Mesolithic activity, and really interestingly, those sites get further apart as well on average. So two things that intuitively don't seem like they'd go together. You'd imagine if you've got more of them, they get closer together. So the period, as well as all this technological change, seems to be tied up with overall restructuring of settlement, overall restructuring of mobility, much as Costa and Sternke suggested they would. It is really hard to see how that dispersion of settlement and that increased amount of settlement can simply be read as population decline. I don't really believe you can read radiocarbon data as population very easily anyway, but it's not easy in this instance to see how that should be read as population decline. At a fairly simplistic reading of it, it might actually suggest population increase. But I think there's that filter of the changing mobility system. We also need to think about some of the really nice and creative things that happen in the Irish later Mesolithic, and not just those macrolithic flakes and blades which dominate. So on the right, as you're looking here, is a so-called Moina point. These are ground slate or shale points, although some of them should actually probably be described as knives because they have cutting edges as well. Wonderful artifacts. This one from Clonara is actually 30 centimeters long. It's technological innovation, creating artifacts of quite elaborate form and some aesthetic beauty as well. Nothing like this is known in the Mesolithic of Britain. You get loads like this in the Mesolithic of Scandinavia. Actually, I'm not suggesting there's a direct link there at all. It's probably to do with the functional properties of shale and how you work it, but it's a wonderful innovation. You also have a range of unusual and really poorly understood core tools, such as this chert pick at the bottom left, and up at the top left, we have perforated cowrie shells from the late Mesolithic in Ireland, dating to the very latest parts of the Mesolithic of Ireland, from the Shell Midden at Fenor in County Clare in the west of Ireland, basically exactly the same as the perforated cowrie shells from the Oronsay Middens at the west of Scotland at exactly the same time. And yet people will tell you Ireland was isolated at this time, that Ireland was not in contact with other areas. But we've got exactly the same material culture in the two areas. It's interesting to note another impact of nationalism in here and colonial histories, and that's thinking about our terminology. So Ireland, as I say, is seen to have an early and a late Mesolithic. Chantal Connella's recent remodelling of all of the British Mesolithic now, and typically that's just been discussed as an earlier and a later Mesolithic, Chantal breaks this into 4 periods: early, middle, late and final. all I want to stress here is actually these things map together reasonably well. The early Mesolithic in Britain, a star car type Mesolithic, broadblade as we sometimes call it, Maglemosian if you want to give it a European context, is unknown in Ireland. Chantal's middle Mesolithic is characterised by lots of microliths, particularly scalene triangle microliths, and things like large pit houses, large pits, exactly what we find in the earlier Mesolithic of Ireland. The late Mesolithic in Britain is seen as a regionalisation of practices. Microliths continue, but they become increasingly regionally diverse. Arguably, the shift from early to later Mesolithic in Ireland is an example of that regionalisation just taken to another level. So rather than seeing Ireland as doing something weird and unusual and different, putting it in its proper context highlights that Ireland is doing similar things. And Chantal and I are going to try and actually work this through in a paper we're just finalising at the moment, probably for Mesolithic miscellany, to think about what that implies in our terminology. Anyway, we're in trouble at the moment in Ireland if we do find a star-car type Mesolithic, because we're going to be forced to call it the even earlier Mesolithic, and that's really not a good name. Final point I want to make about Tasmania is another example of where this lurks in our construction of the Mesolithic. And I should point out, when I started writing my book, I had no intention of thinking about Tasmania. I had no intention of doing this at all. But I was following ideas back through references, really trying to understand where claims came from. And suddenly Tasmania appeared, large and centre. So, recent paper by Dan Bradley, Laura Cassidy and colleagues got lots of headlines because of claims it made about incest in the Neolithic passage tombs of Ireland. But there was a little bit of work in there as well about Mesolithic genotypes, particularly based on 2 Mesolithic individuals. And Laura says that one aspect of that is that there is very little evidence for inbreeding. And as Laura says, that she found this remarkable, given that the population of Ireland is typically estimated at 3,000 to 10,000 people. Now, I don't believe in population estimates at all in prehistory. I find them really hard to justify. But it's worth just chasing this for a moment. So, Lara is provides a reference for Woodman's 2015 book. As far as I can see, he never says 3,000 to 10,000, but I might miss that. I can see that he says 3,000 to 5,000. And that assessment from Woodland is based on Rhys-Jones, I always want to say Griff Rhys-Jones, but it's not Griff. Rhys-Jones' accounts, he's an Australian archaeologist who was estimating population of Tasmania at contact time based on the accounts of this fine-looking individual on the left of our screen, George Augustus Robinson. George Augustus Robinson was the British agent tasked with removing the Tasmanians from Tasmania and resettling them on islands off the coast of their homeland. He did take an interest in Tasmanian Aboriginal culture, but clearly his accounts are of the time, and they are exemplars of that myth of extinction and scientific racism that we talked about before. And Musha, in a recent paper, has talked about these accounts of population by settler administrations as being a demographics of removal. This is a demographics which is designed to build arguments and to enable the removal of indigenous populations. How many of them are there? How many of them were there? How many of them are left? Where can we move them to? This is not neutral information. Again, most modern accounts overall suggest that the population of Tasmania at colonisation time may be about 6,000 to 10,000. And if you want to use these numbers, and if you factor in the size of Ireland relative to Tasmania overall, Ireland should probably be between about 7,000 and 12,000 overall. What we've done, again, is embedded colonial Tasmania into our narratives about the Mesolithic of Ireland. And as a consequence, we've made it smaller and simpler than it might have been. The other thing that I think is really interesting here is one key aspect of those colonial accounts is the recognition that the population of the island of Tasmania is not homogeneous. At the time of contact, Tasmania was divided into 100 clans, 9 nations, and 5 different language groups. And some of those nations were at long-term war with each other. Some of them were very friendly with their neighbours as well. I have no idea what the implication of that population structure is for the population genetics of those communities. But it raises the question, why have we assumed that the appropriate population to consider for two Mesolithic individuals is the population of the island as a whole? The genetics is sampling a breeding population. We don't know that that is the same as the population of the island as a whole. And what's, I think, important here is that we don't just think about population size, but we think about population structures. To close the Tasmanian point here, I just want to make a couple of points. I hope to have shown you that colonial-era Tasmania has appeared in the Mesolithic of Ireland in ways we might not have expected, that we've actually embedded this into some of our narratives, and that's still ongoing. Given what we know about the misrepresentations that were included in those colonial-era accounts, I think we have to ask, is this good science? Is this a sound way of practicing archaeology? And people will have their own opinions on that, but it's an important question to raise. The other one, and I think it's a little bit harder, is to ask whether this is ethical practice. If you were to go and try and work with Indigenous communities today, you'd try and get informed prior consent about collaborating with them, developing understandings that try and meet different worldviews. But the narratives we're looking at, the accounts we're looking at, are extractivist. No permission was asked. These were accounts that were written by settlers because they assumed that they had the right to do so, and they were written to be consumed in metropolitan European and Western societies. And there is, I think, issues about the use of that extractivist knowledge. And in particular, although I've not made a big play of it in here, through many of these accounts, in the 19th century, Tasmania was quite deliberately constructed. Aboriginal Tasmanians were constructed as being our prehistory. They were what we had been. Our societies had evolved and changed and developed, and theirs had not. Their distance in space was equivalent to a distance in time. And clearly that representation was damaging and wrong. But we're doing exactly the same thing again. We're doing it by turning those communities into the model for the Mesolithic of Ireland. I feel I'm leaning down too much. I think this has dropped. Okay, the second of my strange tales is about how archaeologists have actually, I think, turned their back on the most important evidence for the Mesolithic in Ireland. And once again, that's allowed us just to recycle stereotypes of what hunter-gatherers are and what hunter-gatherers do. Sorry, that was just lagging a moment. Okay, so the images on the left here show a couple of examples of the sorts of material that have been recovered through developer-funded archaeology since the mid to late 1990s. At the top left here are the remarkable wooden fish traps from Clowenstown in County Meath, a short distance north of Dublin and dating to the later Mesolithic. Remarkable artifacts and a truly spectacular discovery. And there's been other spectacular discoveries in commercial archaeology in Ireland. The earliest cremation cemetery in Britain and Ireland, what may be the earliest all-over polished axe in northwest Europe from the site of Hermitage in Limerick. Really remarkable things that are there. But most of the time, what people find on road schemes is a thin occupation soil, a few stake holes, a post hole, maybe a pit, maybe a fireplace, maybe an occupation soil, whatever we actually think one of those is. Nothing outstanding, nothing stunning, quiet, ephemeral archaeology. A couple of recent statements by very senior figures in Irish archaeology have kind of commented on what's been found on these sites. So John Waddell, in the top quote here, talks about how the extraordinary expansion of archaeological work in that sector is confirmed that foragers were across the island as a whole, confirmed the island-wide presence of foragers, but has not advanced our knowledge of the period. So we knew they got further, but we haven't really found out anything more. And Peter Woodman argues that the contribution from these infrastructural development excavations is not as great as might be expected. I find these really, really problematic statements, and I find them problematic for a number of reasons. First is, I think these show a lack of gratitude to the work that has been done by many, many archaeologists on many, many road schemes and many, many developments, often in quite difficult condition. Thanks for what you tried, but you've not found anything we're interested in. And the second is that actually it just to me suggests a misunderstanding of how archaeology works. What we're finding in the main on road scheme archaeology are these quiet sites with ephemeral scatters, a few stake holes, a few fireplaces. And what these quotes are doing is being a little bit almost petulant, if you like. You're not finding the stuff I want you to find. Therefore, what you're finding isn't important. Rather than trying to develop an approach that says, well, actually, what does all of this stuff that we are finding repeatedly, consistently, what does that tell us about the period? And it really is, sorry, I meant to show that slide just before, it really is, that's the dominant material that we're finding overall. So just the decade from 2000 to 2009, there are 71 different sites that were radiocarbon dated to the Mesolithic there. Nearly 60% of all sites ever dated to the Mesolithic. Of those 71, I think maybe 3 were research excavations. The rest would all have been commercial sector. So this is the data for the Mesolithic of Ireland. This is the material. I want to try and bring you into a way of thinking about that by considering architecture. Okay, so our images of Mesolithic architecture in Ireland, and I realise it's not a word which we always use for thinking about hunter-gatherers, our images are dominated by the site of Mount Sandal, earlier Mesolithic site in the north of Ireland, occupied a short time after 8000 BC, very much in keeping with the kind of pit house tradition of the middle Mesolithic of northern Britain as well, and there are examples from Scotland known just like this. 6-metre diameter circular, subcircular structure, reasonably sized posts, leaning in by about 30 degrees or so, reconstructed around the central half 3 or 4 times. And this is a reconstruction of it we built at the Centre for Experimental Archaeology at UCD. They are imposing structures. Now, the problem with Mount Sandal as an example of the type of architecture characteristic of the Mesolithic in Ireland is it's the only one of its kind. We don't have lots of other examples like this. And you look at discussions in the literature and it's full of a confusion of terms. On one site, there's a discussion about what the excavator interpreted as huts. Someone a few years later comes back to say, oh, no, they're not huts, they're windbreaks. Well, no one's defined what the term hut means. No one's defined what the term windbreaks mean. And if you look at the ethnographic literature, windbreaks are used as huts. So it's really not getting us very far. So how can we think about this to tell us something about those hunter-gatherer lives? Well, I turned to a typology developed in Norway by Celia Fretheim to make sense of the really remarkable evidence they have in Norway for Mesolithic buildings. And Celia suggested that you could divide these into 3 types: houses, composite buildings, and tents. So houses, Celia suggests, they're large structures designed for permanent or long-term occupation, substantial timber builds, the use of turf or rubber coverings, very much what Mount Sandal is. Mount Sandal is a house, according to this. Composite buildings are buildings where some feature of the architecture is left on site. So you might imagine a structure that relies on large poles, for example, and those poles are left on site, and every year when you arrive in that location, you reuse the poles, but you gather a new covering, be it hide or branches or whatever it might be. And that in some way, those facilities you're leaving behind act as what she calls space attractors. It's a reason to come back to that location. And I've speculated that the sites at Eglinton, again in the north, you can't see the detail in the slides here, but the recurrent similarities in ground plan at Eglinton are suggestive of a series of reconstructions of a building, perhaps using poles that have been left on site. Certainly much easier than trying to carry 6 or 7 metre long poles through the woods of Ireland every time you go anywhere. The other one, the most important for what I want to say now, are tents. And as Celia says, tents are portable dwellings. They're built to be easily assembled, disassembled, and transported. And almost by their nature, they leave little or no archaeological trace. We have very rare circumstances where we might be able to identify tents, but most of the time we'll see very little evidence of them. You'll find instead the scatters of activity that took place around them. You'll find the fireplaces that were lit either in or outside those buildings. You'll find, basically, what we find on all of the commercial archaeological excavated sites in Ireland. So I think most of those sites are showing us that people were using tents. And just as an aside here, it's worth just noting, this is the picture at the bottom is my excavations at Belderrig in the northwest of Ireland. And the stony layers you see here are an anthropogenic soil containing lots of plant remains, artifacts, small amounts of fish bone. It's an occupation soil, to use that word. Which would be coherent with people coming back and using tents and repeatedly occupying a site over the long term. You're not finding any one coherent occupation, but you're finding the accumulation of all of that. And this is typically in an Irish context being seen as quite a low-key, small-scale activity. If we were in Norway and these deposits were just a little bit thicker and a little bit more organic, they'd be called, I'm not going to attempt to say it, but culture layers. And those culture layers on Norwegian coastal sites are interpreted as being sedentary settlement. It's just a very, very different framework. But I leave that to one side. So I've suggested that hunter-gatherers in Ireland relied an awful lot on tents, that most of our archaeology shows people living in these very mobile buildings. Well, so what, says everybody? That's what hunter-gatherers do, isn't it? They're mobile, and therefore they live in tents. This doesn't tell us anything. Well, actually, I think we can ask a much more important question. Why are they choosing to live in tents? We know that they, at times, built houses and stayed in. So why is it this choice of tents? And I don't think that has to be simply determined by subsistence. This is a choice to live in these structures. So we now turn to the comparative ethnography of hunter-gatherers, and particularly loads of really important work about how very mobile hunter-gatherers, and I think the Irish Mesolithic is very mobile, the types of spaces that they live in and the implications this has for their sociality. So a lengthy quote here by Naritba David overall. The key point is what she's saying here is throughout the day, every day, the fewness of these people, all of whom are relatives, that doesn't mean biological relatives, impresses itself on the observer. The depth of people's presence to each other, the constant exposure of everyone in that community to everyone else who is there. They live in open structures. They live with very little of what we would consider private spaces. They are present to the rest of their community all of the time. And Barry Hewlett, the illustration here is 4 men sharing a sleeping platform in one of these communities. Barry's argued very persuasively that this sharing space together, being really proximate with each other, builds trust. And he actually tracks this through looking at hormones in the people he's working with. It reduces stress. Social practices of sharing further reduce these sorts of things. So the intimate living, as he puts it, actually builds and constructs trust and community because people live together, because they come together in these kinds of ways. Sharing of resources, sharing of space. Jerome Lewis argues that if you sit around a fire with the communities he works with, the Baka, what happens is people share their bodies in a sense that they will lean over you and they'll lean over you and they'll hook their arm around your knees or they'll put their leg up over you. It's nothing sexual in that sense here. It's just sharing bodies, sharing contact, sharing space. Thinking again about sharing, David Friesheim and Noah Lavie argue again that the rule of thumb about these mobile hunter-gatherers is houses are open or semi-open structures, very light, easily modified. And as I say, house design and site structure manifests a social preference to ensure maximum sharing, co-presence, and living together. The choice of architecture is about creating a particular kind of sociality. And Tom Whitlock, in a really important book, Anthropology and the Economy of Sharing, argues that the foundation of demand sharing amongst hunter-gatherers is that it's a recognition of the way that different lives in a community are joined, that it's your fellow community members are your extended self. And he says really simply, sharing needs to be placed on the side that is opposite the house, that houses and privacy break down the trust that enables sharing, that enables these egalitarian relationships. So my fairly simple statement to you is that the preference for tents in the later Mesolithic of Ireland is to enable and maintain this type of sociality based on trust, based on sharing, and perhaps, I'll say something more about it in a moment, comparatively egalitarian social relationships. The suggestion here that people are living in quite small mobile groups should not be taken to claim that these are people who are living isolated lives and these small groups are isolated. There's a long-standing assumption that hunter-gatherers live in small bands of about 25 people and that those are based very much on biological kin. It's entirely misleading. The small bands exist, but they are incredibly fluid. People move in and out of those groups, sometimes across great distances, and networks of non-biological kinship, fictive kinship, if you want to use a difficult term like that, enable people to become part of the community. And it's just possible, we're seeing hints of that in the Irish later Mesolithic record, where we have a number of sites which have very small proportions of material from long distance, over 100, sometimes 200 kilometres. And it's only ever a very small number of artefacts there. So it's just possible that this is showing us this movement of people in and out of these groups. If you really want to push this argument a little bit, I'm not quite sure whether I fully believe this, but I think it's worth raising, is the very end of the Mesolithic period, is the one period that we feel radiocarbon evidence might suggest some aspect of population growth, albeit at quite a low level. And if you follow again the general theory on hunter-gatherers and how they evolve and change over time, it's in context of population growth and increased pressure on resources that egalitarian societies may begin to develop different forms of social hierarchy. Ideas about ownership of resources might develop an exclusivity overall. And there's a big series of arguments about how that might lead to trans-egalitarian foragers or complex hunting and gathering societies. And there's a couple of things in the late Mesolithic record of Ireland that you could look at as, you know, these are quite elaborate, fancy artifacts. Maybe they fit into that type of space, like the Moyna Point. It's possible that through this and through this tendency that's there for people to develop more accumulation of material, to develop more property, it's possible that this long-standing commitment to living in open structures, to living in these types of communities, to build trust, is actually a way of resisting the development of inequality in these societies. Maybe I'm pushing that a little bit too far, but communities based on trust and trying to resist inequality, I like that as a story. To close, I want to use just one site to try and bring some of the threads of this together. This is the site of Shannara in County Tyrone, excavated on a road scheme by Fintan Walsh and Christina O'Regan. Fintan tells me it was particularly damp and cold through large periods of this excavation. It's a Mesolithic site, very late in the Mesolithic, about 4,200, characterized by spreads of material, a few pits, a few fireplaces, a few artifacts in a wetland area by a river. Characteristically Mesolithic. They did really good work excavating it, really good work sampling it, and there's a really nice account of the different plant remains that are there, and they talk about gathering, because the report talks about gathering because they've got nothing else to talk about. This is exactly the site that the technological models would say is showing you this technological decline. This is the impoverished Irish Mesolithic, and this is the type of site that John Waddell and Peter Woodman would tell you isn't telling you anything about the Irish Mesolithic. On the contrary, this is telling us everything about the Irish Mesolithic at this time. This location was somewhere where, in a wetland, near a river, a community stopped. They constructed their dwellings in the way they always did. They used tents and light, open structures, so they could share space together, because they knew that that was the way of living that maintained their community, that helped build bonds of trust, that helped maintain sharing, that helped keep things equal in those communities. They were using innovative technologies. A moina point found on site, for example, would have been quite new within the Mesolithic at this time. And they were living the best lives that they knew how to lead. They were choosing to do things to maintain their particular understandings of the world. And in that sense, Shannara 3 stands in very well for the Mesolithic as a whole. I hope that's given you some sense of how thinking about our questions and asking different questions perhaps builds a slightly different kind of understanding of the Mesolithic period. There's only really 2 chapters from the book. There's another 8 of them I could have told different stories about, but I think they're useful stories to bring to audiences, to prompt people to think in different ways about their material. So my thanks to you all. I close with 2 prompts. One is that if you found any of that interesting and those ways of thinking about hunter-gatherers interesting, consider coming to UCD to do an MSc in hunter-gatherer archaeology. This is what we do. This is how we think. And the second is, I'm very grateful to Oxbow Books, who, for the occasion of this lecture, have offered us a 20% discount on the book itself. There are paper copies of this flyer at the back next to the wine, so don't feel you have to scribble down all of the details here, but 20% off, 15 quid, it's nearly Christmas. What more could you want on all of this? Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Well, thank you, Graeme, for that very interesting update on the Irish Mesolithic, which it's good to see getting reassessed, and a whole lot of new evidence of various kinds taken into account. I wonder if I can ask if there are any questions. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for that. The population estimates for Tasmanian Aborigines have always been extraordinarily dodgy. Trying to translate those over into Ireland, though, I mean, Tassie's a bit bigger than Ireland. It has a climate that's not wildly different, but the geography, flora and fauna are entirely different, and there's absolutely no reason why one would think that Ireland would support the same number of people that Tassie does, or more likely the other way around, that Tassie would support the number of people that Ireland would. Interested in your comments.
I agree entirely. It wasn't my idea to use that as the basis for this, but that's the comparison which has been embedded within these discussions. And I think people, they turn to the Woodman book and they use that and they don't understand where that's come from. But no, I agree entirely that I don't think it is a reliable or a robust comparison on the kind of biogeographical approach that you suggest there, even before you then think about some of the ethical issues and the colonial context. But absolutely.
Anything? One here and then one there.
Thank you. One of the defining factors or distinctive factors of the Irish geography must be this incredible estuary of the Shannon and its various bits and pieces, extending right up the middle and getting everywhere. And that presumably was open to salmon in, ginormous numbers, much bigger than would actually be known now, because we've, tried to eat the things to extinction. Is there any evidence? And I mean, a conglomerate, a settlement based around those would actually fit very well with your sort of semi-permanent occupation, settling down there for probably June, July, and August. Is there any evidence for this in the record, particularly in the form of bones in wetland sites?
The classic example of what you're talking about isn't on the Shannon, but would actually be Mount Sandal, which is a large semi-permanent structure on the River Bann, where there is a bone assemblage which includes a lot of salmonids. Be it salmon or trout, we can't quite be certain. But that very much looks like the sort of thing that you're discussing. Yeah. That appears early in the Mesolithic period. We don't have anything quite like that later in the Mesolithic period. So maybe that was something which people lived in that way for some time, and then they started living in other ways. One of the problems is that parts of the Shannon estuary, because of sea level change, the Mesolithic, more coastal parts of that estuary are now lost to us as well. So we won't see some of those landscapes.
Thanks. And then there's one over here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was marvellous to hear that refreshing assessment of developer-funded archaeology and its contribution. Could I just turn that round slightly, though? And I forgive my ignorance because I'm not aware of what the research framework system is like within Ireland. But having been associated with the research framework here, where we actually found it quite difficult to get synthetic academic input into that framework. Are you in a position whereby you can provide that background to those road archaeologists who didn't have something upon which to base their findings and come up with a more imaginative, interpretive answer to what they were doing?
Thank you for the kind words. The first part of it is there's no equivalent of scarf in Ireland, and I think that's a shame. That's unfortunate. The second thing is in terms of how to get that story out to people on the road schemes. It's why I wrote the book, and it was why I tried to make sure it went to a publisher where it wasn't going to be too expensive. And then doing events like, I've done similar events like this in Ireland. I did parts of this for a CPD program for the Institute of Irish Archaeologists, and the intention is to get that story out to people. And I know that the further work will prove that some of the things I say are wrong. And that's fine. It's a story which most of it holds pretty well. And if people want to come along and prove the bits of it that don't work, that's how we advance knowledge. That's how things move on. But I think the period badly needed a story, and a story which wasn't just the hunter-gatherers, they hunt and they gather, and everything else can be explained by the state of Ireland as an island overall.
Simon, and then over here.
Sorry, I've got a question online, from online, if that's okay. It says, so interesting about Tasmania. Are there any helpful good island case studies from outside of the British Isles which we can compare and contrast with the evidence from Mesolithic Ireland to help us understand the latter better?
First of all, I say it should be the British and Irish Isles, not the British Isles.
I didn't say who it was.
That's okay. All of these comparisons depend on exactly the question that you're asking, and there are no perfect comparisons to be made here. It may well be that actually there are good reasons, with some of the caution that gentleman here expressed earlier, that there are good reasons to make comparisons with Tasmania for some aspects of the data, for the particular questions that people are trying to ask, and if people are cognizant of the nature of the data that we're using. They understand the context within which that data was gathered, and therefore how reliable it might be. So there will never be a perfect one-on-one fit. There never is. Archaeology is always inherently comparative. We use analogies all the time, whether we acknowledge them or not, and it's just, I think, being explicit about the basis of the comparisons that we choose to make. So I have no simple answer in that sense, other than it will vary according to the question.
And then one over here.
Thank you for the lecture first. I've got an empirical question. So how do archaeologists actually estimate the Mesolithic demography in the context of people moving in tents and not being sedentary?
How do we measure how mobile communities were?
No, how you estimate the demography.
Demography.
Yeah.
With great difficulty is the answer. And first of all, I should say that I don't really believe that we can address demography very, very well. But there's been a number of different approaches used over time, generally tending to be based either on the frequency of sites and changing frequency of sites in different periods as a proxy for population, which is problematic because there are a whole variety of taphonomic issues involved there, and also the way in which sites were made in the past. The other one, which has been dominant recently, has been the use of radiocarbon dates. So assuming that the number of radiocarbon dates relates in some way to population. And there's a variety of statistical models which have been used to model that. The problem there, again, is that the relationship between human activity in the past that leaves material that might be radiocarbon dated and population is not at all clear. So when we did the work on the Irish material, our biggest change in the frequency of radiocarbon dates was the graph I showed earlier, showing a big increase in the 7th millennia BC. That is also, at that time, the way in which sites are being formed changes dramatically. So I've got no confidence that that increase in the number of sites means an increase in the number of people. It means an increase in the number of sites because people were doing different things. There's one bit towards the end of the period where the types of sites remains very much the same, the types of practices remains very much the same, and we do see a slight increase in the frequency. And at that one, I think we might be able to talk about a very small level of population increase. But it's really tricky, and I think most of those accounts, the statistical modelling is so dense as well, it's so hard to break down. Most of those accounts I don't think have given due cognizance to that creation of the archaeological evidence. The final one that comes in terms of demography increasingly is genetic work itself, which will make statements about the relative population size. Again, there are, I think, issues there just to unpick about the population structures as well. But demography is enormously challenging. It's become very, very popular of late, not least because the availability of big data. So, people have got databases of radiocarbon dates across Europe as a whole, which they've now got the computer power to process and go after all of that material. And what you also then often get is you get your demographic model, and let's get a climate model from somewhere, a climate curve, and look, one goes up and the other one goes down. Must be causation in there somewhere. And again, the good work does this well, but a lot of work doesn't. It just pattern matches on that.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, one.
Thank you, Dr. Warren. Just a quickie. The fish trap, I've never actually seen one of those until last week. I think I might have tripped over one on the West Coast. You got a dimension for that and an age? Thank you.
The dimensions, I'm guessing those traps are about 2 meters long, that kind of size. And the age, I think it's about 5,400 BC, give or take. Sorry, I wasn't anticipating my radiocarbon memory being tested in quite that way. They're wonderful things. Go to the National Museum of Ireland, they're on display. Probably a little bit under 2 meters, actually, but of that order.
Any others? Great, well, while we're seeing if any other questions are coming in, I wonder if I can ask, what happens at the end? I mean, you have a final horizon at 4000 BC, and that is often a kind of date suggested widely across what I call Britain and Ireland. British and Irish Isles is a relative. I've seen it thrice this year, but never before this year. But Britain and Ireland, my understanding is the translation of what the Irish Gaelic says. It says Ireland and Britain, but not the Isles bit. What happens at the end? Why does the system stop? Why don't people go on hunting and gathering? Because the take-up by early farmers in landscape terms must be relatively modest to start with. So why is there a tailpiece, or does it just show differently?
Do you have another hour? It's a complicated and a very good question. So there's a few things in there. So we have a very well-defined early Neolithic in Ireland, a so-called house horizon, to about 3,750 Cal BC. And that's very clearly a quite consistent Neolithic. And by that period, there's very little trace of anything Mesolithic going on. There's also a period before that in varied schemes, early Neolithic 1 in the Cultivating Societies scheme, where there's some slightly different things going on. And myself, Jessica Smith and Muriel McClatchy have argued there's a phase there where you might have a form of agriculture, perhaps based a little bit more around cattle than cereals. There are some upland sites and enclosures. There's evidence of cattle feasting at some of the lowland and what were Mesolithic sites now have that. And there's continuity of Mesolithic practice on a number of sites as well. Problem is, and the reason our radiocarbon modelling didn't deal with that is actually I think that period from about 4,200 down to about 3,700 needs someone to actually go back and deal with the material, to look on a site-by-site basis and say, is this actually Mesolithic or is this Neolithic? Because people have just held on to really easy labels around this. And it means that if you're taking the stone tools, for example, often you can't really be certain what's there. And we couldn't do that as part of this review. Okay. So we've left it from that discussion. But certainly by 3,700, you've got farmers, some of whom definitely they moved to the island. We have a variety of evidence showing that there's migrating communities at this time. But there might be something slightly different going on before we get that kind of classic house horizon Neolithic. Again, probably involving the movement of people coming into the island, but what forms of interaction are taking place at that stage, we don't know at the moment.
But thereafter, if you go beyond the house horizon, there is no traceable hunter-gatherer continuity, or is there?
No, people hunt and people gather, but does that make you a hunter-gatherer?
But they don't do it.
It's not Mesolithic.
It's not Mesolithic. Yeah. Okay, thank you for that.
Sorry, I've got one last one from online, came in just now. Thanks for this is from Shannon Fraser. Thanks for such a stimulating talk, Graeme. Given that you have so eloquently demonstrated how even speaking to each other as archaeologists, we can ignore the amazing social creativity of Mesolithic communities in Ireland, I wonder if you have any thoughts on how we can infuse the wider public narratives of prehistory with an understanding of this exciting creativity. I am finding the public story of prehistory here in Northern Ireland very old-fashioned and not particularly inspiring.
Thanks, Shannon. A nice small question again on that. We tell stories, we communicate, and it's no coincidence that I told you a story about hunter-gatherer communities creating forms of society bound by trust and creativity and dynamism and trying to resist inequality, partly because I believe those stories. I think that actually helps us make sense of the narratives, but also because I certainly find that the more I read and try and understand about contemporary and near-contemporary hunter-gatherer communities, egalitarian communities, the political alternative that offers as a way of relating to other beings in the world around us, to other people, to animals, to spirits, to places, I find that a compellingly interesting way of imagining what it is to be human. And I think telling stories about the past like that has value in prompting questions and raising questions. And let's be fair, it's fairly bleak times at the moment. I think trying to tell stories that say that trust and creativity is at the core of prehistory, I think there's value in that. There are other stories that people can tell. There were times when being Mesolithic in Ireland was rubbish. It rained like this and the food had all run away and you were hungry and you're cold. And of course that's part of it. But we can tell different types of stories and give, I think, maybe different types of hope and different types of questions for people. Sorry, that's very, very grandiose, but it was. I wanted to tell a story that people had and could look at, and I wanted to tell a story that I felt had some value and resonance in a again, a version of this paper I gave a few weeks back, a couple of people afterwards actually said, thank you for telling a story with trust in it. Thank you for making that important, and thank you for making that matter. And that, to me, seems to be something useful.
Thank you. Simon, can I...
Well, Graeme, thank you so much. It has been a real treat to hear you. You've given us 2 chapters. We could sit here all night. I want all the rest. I want everything else. Shannon put her finger right on it when she said, very eloquent. I mean, thank you for your honesty. Thank you for your enormous contribution to Mesolithic archaeology in Ireland. I remember the olden days when Peter Woodman bestrode the stage and completely dominated the story of Mesolithic Ireland. I think what you have said about the dangers of colonial thinking, the importance of asking the right questions, the importance of giving a bit of respect to the people who dig up this stuff under very difficult conditions, are fundamentally important. And I know that you are going to go on and develop aspects of this superb narrative. So goodness me, Graeme, lots to talk about. I loved it. I was inspired by what you said. So, and I know that the people online have greatly enjoyed it, as the people in this room. So thank you so much.
Can I just say one thing, which is just to note, and I should have done earlier, that the reconstruction drawings in the book are all done by my daughter, who was 16 years old at the time that she did them.
Well, thank you very much, Graeme, for this presentation, which we've all enjoyed. Before inviting the audience here, but not those online, to go for a glass of wine at the back of the room and to continue the discussion there, can I just remind you of a couple of things that Simon has said. The meeting on the 26th on Scarf, its past and its future. The anniversary meeting on the 30th, which will have the usual elections and the usual business, and a short talk by Dr. Nella Sholma Mason on an antiquarian, an early female antiquarian in Orkney. And then our next meeting back here in December, on Thursday the 15th, will be Professor James Graham Campbell talking on the Kaloran Bay Colonsay Viking burial in its wider context. So I look forward to seeing you all at one or perhaps all 3 of these occasions. And thanks again to Graeme. Good night.